Las Vegas, early 1970s. The room is already on its feet, but not because of the song. In the front row sits a man in a wheelchair, trying very hard not to be noticed. Security stiffens. A manager leans in close and whispers the words everyone agrees on. Not now. Cameras. Contracts. Dean Martin sees him anyway. The orchestra is mid-phrase when Dean raises his hand. The music collapses into silence. Thousands of people freeze, unsure whether this is part of the act or the moment it breaks. Then he steps off the stage. Not toward the spotlight. Not toward the applause. Toward the one place he was explicitly told never to go. In a few seconds, he will say a single sentence, quietly, without a microphone, that witnesses will repeat for decades, never quite agreeing on the exact wording, only on the feeling it left behind. But the real shock won't come from the pause, or the cameras still rolling, or the rules being broken in plain sight. It will come after the embrace, when it becomes clear who that man really is, and why this wasn't an act of kindness at all, but a reckoning that had been waiting for years. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Las Vegas in the late 60s knew how to manufacture ease. The lights were calibrated, the laughter rehearsed, the smoke drifting just thick enough to blur edges without hiding faces. In the big showroom, Dean Martin leaned into the illusion as he always did. The loose posture, the half-lidded eyes, the timing that suggested nothing in the world could rush him. To the audience, he looked untouchable. A man who didn't care, because caring was for people with something to lose. Behind the curtain, the mood was different. Clipboards moved faster than smiles. Contracts were discussed in low voices, fingers tapping margins where clauses lived. Sponsors had expectations. Networks had rules. Management had one job: keep the image intact. No surprises. No contact with the crowd. No moments that could be misread once frozen on tape. The order had been repeated before the house lights dimmed. Tonight was being recorded. Multiple cameras, clean angles, nothing that couldn't be cut clean if needed. Security lined the front like furniture. Visible enough to discourage, invisible enough not to distract. One of them had already pointed out a man in the first rows, seated lower than the rest, his chair unmistakable. The word wasn't spoken, but the meaning was clear. Not tonight. Not on camera. Dean heard the jokes land. He felt the rhythm of the room settle into his hands. He followed the script because that's what kept the machine running. But then he saw the man. Not at first. Not directly. Just a detail that didn't fit. The stillness. The way the man's hands stayed folded, as if applause required more energy than he could afford. He wasn't leaning forward. He wasn't waving. He was doing the opposite of asking to be seen, and somehow that made him impossible to ignore. Dean smiled through a line that arrived a beat late. Only the first rows noticed. A joke trailed off instead of snapping shut. The orchestra hesitated, just long enough to register something was wrong. From the wings, a sharp movement, a hand slicing the air, a reminder. Keep going. He did. For a moment. Then he looked again. The man had lowered his eyes, as if hoping attention might pass over him the way it had learned to pass over so many things. The chair was angled slightly away from the aisle, not blocking, not claiming space. A quiet negotiation with the world. Dean felt the weight of the room shift. The cameras kept rolling. Red lights stayed on. Whatever was about to happen was already happening. He made another joke, softer this time, and drifted a step closer to the edge of the stage. Security straightened. One of them shook his head, barely perceptible, but firm. Not because of danger. Because of what the sponsors might see tomorrow morning. Dean held his smile. It didn't reach his eyes now. Something tightened there. Not fear, not anger, but recognition. The kind that disrupts rehearsed ease. The man looked up. For a fraction of a second, the room balanced on that exchange. A performer known for never taking anything seriously stood under lights bright enough to erase shadows, while management watched from darkness, ready to intervene. The audience waited for the next line. Dean didn't say it. The silence stretched just long enough to be felt, not long enough to be explained. And in that gap, the image everyone thought they understood began, quietly, to crack. The orchestra waited for a cue that didn't come. Instruments hovered between notes, bows suspended, brass held without breath. What should have been a seamless continuation turned into a pocket of stillness that felt heavier than noise. Dean stood at the lip of the stage, one hand resting where the spotlight fell hardest, the other hanging loose, undecided. This wasn't a gesture meant for anyone else. There was no calculation left, no sense of timing for effect. It was an internal pause, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He had stepped out of rhythm before, deliberately, for laughs. But this was different. The room sensed it, without understanding why. From the aisle, a security man moved. Not fast, not aggressive. He simply positioned himself where he had been trained to stand when something drifted off script. The message was physical, not verbal. This ends here. For a breath, it looked as if Dean might retreat, let the machinery pull him back into motion. He had done that many times before. Instead, he leaned down slightly, just enough that the microphone missed his voice. "What's your name?" he said. Only a few people heard it. The guard, a woman 2 seats away, the man himself. No amplification, no polish. A question that wasn't meant to travel. The man answered quietly. Too quietly for the stage, but Dean caught it. The guard shifted again, a fraction closer, hand ready. For one suspended second, the possibility of a confrontation flickered. Not dramatic, not violent, just the unthinkable awkwardness of stopping Dean Martin mid-show. Dean lifted a hand, palm down. Not to the audience, to the guard. "Give me a moment," he said, still without the microphone. It wasn't a command, it wasn't a plea. It was something rarer in that space, a request that assumed it would be honored. He stepped off the stage. Gasps didn't ripple. Applause didn't erupt. The sound that filled the room was emptier than either, a collective holding of breath. People didn't know what to do with it. They weren't being invited in. They were being left behind. The distance between the stage and the first row was short, but it felt exposed. Without the elevation, without the lights framing him, Dean looked suddenly like a man walking through a decision he hadn't prepared for. He hesitated once, just once, as if weighing the cost he already understood. When he reached the chair, the man tried to straighten, apologetic, instinctively minimizing himself. Dean shook his head. "Stay," he said. The contact was brief, awkward. One arm, not both. A careful lean that avoided spectacle. It wasn't the embrace of a performer playing tenderness. It was clumsy, human, and over almost as soon as it began. Up close, Dean noticed the man's breathing, controlled, measured, as if each one mattered. The realization landed without commentary. This wasn't about attention. This was about time. "I didn't expect this," the man said, not accusing, just factual. Dean nodded. "Neither did I." When he stepped back, the orchestra was still waiting. The guard had moved aside. The cameras kept recording, though no one was sure what they were capturing now. Dean turned toward the stage, paused, then glanced back once more. The man had already lowered his gaze again, the moment accepted and released. As Dean climbed the step, the silence followed him. Not approval, not confusion, something quieter and irreversible. The applause at the end came late and uneven, as if the room needed time to remember what was expected of it. Dean bowed out of habit, not acknowledgement. His smile returned for the crowd, familiar and serviceable, but it stayed behind when he stepped through the curtain. The lights cut off sharply. The temperature dropped. Applause became a muffled rumor, already irrelevant. Backstage smelled of sweat, metal, and aftershave. Someone handed him a towel he didn't use. Another voice started explaining what would be said to the press if anyone asked. Dean kept walking. The hallway narrowed, then opened into the dressing area, too quiet for how many people were standing there. The manager spoke first, because that was his role. He had a statement ready. Neutral language, protective language, a moment of generosity, a misunderstanding of protocol. No harm intended. Dean listened without reacting, his jacket still on, one cuff unbuttoned, fingers worrying the fabric as if it required concentration. "I'm not approving that," he said. The room stilled. The manager adjusted his tone, softened it, tried again. Networks, sponsors, optics. Dean sat down slowly, as if his legs had finally remembered their weight. "Then don't release anything," he said. "Silence works." Someone laughed, uncertain. Dean didn't. What unsettled them wasn't defiance. It was the absence of explanation. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't justifying the moment. He was done discussing it. When the others drifted away, some irritated, some relieved, a production assistant remained. She hesitated before speaking, then offered information that hadn't been part of any briefing. "The man from the front row," she said. "He asked if he could leave something for you." Dean looked up. A small envelope lay on the counter. No return address. Just his name, written carefully, not by someone used to signing things. Dean waited until the room was empty before opening it. Inside was a single folded page and an old photograph, creased at the edges. The paper held only a few lines, written plainly. No praise, no thanks. Just a sentence acknowledging what had happened, and another explaining why tonight mattered. He had been there before. Long before Vegas. Long before The Voice, the suits, the jokes. Dean stared at the photograph longer than he needed to. A younger version of himself stood at the edge of the frame, not famous yet, barely confident. The memory attached to it had been filed away decades earlier, labeled resolved. A choice made under pressure. Necessary, final. He folded the paper back into the envelope and sat there until the noise outside thinned into nothing. Exhaustion crept in, the kind that doesn't come from work, but from recognition. Later, long after the cameras were packed and the room reset for tomorrow's show, Dean asked one question, quietly, not to management. Where is he staying? The answer came with a shrug. A place off the Strip. Temporary. Not important. Dean nodded, as if agreeing with something only he could hear. He left through a side exit, no coat, no entourage, the night air sharper than he expected. What he did next wasn't recorded. There were no witnesses worth mentioning. Just a decision carried out without ceremony. Years later, when fragments of the story surfaced, people would assume that moment was the climax. They were wrong. It was only the point where the past stopped waiting. The name arrived 2 days later, spoken once and never repeated. It came through an intermediary who didn't understand its weight, delivered casually over the phone as if it were just another loose end to be tied off. Dean didn't respond. He didn't need to. His hand tightened around the receiver, then relaxed, deliberate, controlled. When he hung up, The house went quiet in a way that felt earned. He stood in the living room without turning on a light. Afternoon in Los Angeles filtered through the windows, pale and indifferent. He crossed to the bar out of habit, then stopped himself. The glass remained empty. Instead, he sat, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The name didn't summon nostalgia. It triggered resistance, a physical recoil he hadn't felt in years. He walked to the window, opened it, let traffic noise rise and fall, then closed it again. The house returned to its controlled silence. That man hadn't just recognized him, he had remembered him, from a time when remembering was dangerous. Late 40s, cheap rooms, promises made too quickly, decisions made faster. Dean had believed then that choosing one path meant severing all others. He had been wrong, but comfortably so. Time had let him believe the consequences belonged to someone else. Now, they had a face. Dean picked up the envelope again, unfolded the photograph. He traced the edge with his thumb, not sentimentally, but methodically, like a man checking a wound he assumed had healed. The memory sharpened. A hallway, an argument kept low, a choice framed as mercy. Necessary. Clean. He had never spoken about it. Not to his wives, not to the men he trusted, especially not to the Rat Pack. There were rules about what stayed buried. This was one of them. The realization arrived without drama. The man in the chair hadn't stumbled into that showroom. He had planned it, studied schedules, chosen the one-night cameras would be present, not to expose, but to ensure Dean couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. Dean sat back, exhaled, and did something he hadn't done in years. He waited. No calls went out. No favors were pulled. He didn't ask anyone to look into it. That would have turned it into a problem to solve. This wasn't that. This was something to face. That evening, he cooked for himself and left the food untouched. Later, he drove without destination, hands steady on the wheel, radio off. He passed familiar streets without seeing them. When he returned home, he placed the photograph in a drawer he rarely opened and closed it carefully. The next morning, he made a decision that surprised even him. He would go alone. Not as Dean Martin. Not as an act of generosity. As a correction. Quiet. Unadvertised. Necessary. By then, the meaning of that moment in Las Vegas had already shifted. It was no longer about a pause in a show or a breach of protocol. It had become something else entirely. A reckoning delayed, not avoided. And it was already underway. The building had no sign worth remembering. A low structure set back from the road, paint faded to a color that once tried to be optimistic. Dean parked where anyone else would, turned off the engine, and sat longer than necessary, letting the silence settle. No one rushed him. No one knew he was there. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Shoes moved softly along the corridor, careful not to disturb what couldn't be fixed anyway. When he gave his name, he didn't give the one people expected. It worked. He was led down a hallway that grew quieter with every step, as if sound itself knew when to stop. The room was small, clean, stripped of anything unnecessary. The man lay propped slightly on pillows, thinner than Dean remembered from the night in Vegas, but alert. His eyes moved first, assessing, then recognizing without surprise. "You came," the man said. Dean nodded. He remained standing, hands at his sides, unsure where to put them now that performance meant nothing. "I wasn't sure you would," the man continued. There was no bitterness in it, just fact. Dean pulled the chair closer and sat. The distance between them closed without ceremony. No greeting followed. They had already passed that point. "You shouldn't have," Dean said finally. "I know," the man replied. "That wasn't the point." They spoke in short sentences, sometimes not at all. Time stretched differently there. Dean listened more than he talked, and when he did speak, he didn't shape the words. He let them fall where they landed. "I don't want help," the man said, when Dean mentioned arrangements, options, resources. "Not that kind." Dean absorbed it without protest. "You don't owe me anything," the man added. "I didn't come for that." From the drawer beside the bed, he took out a folder, edges worn smooth by handling. Inside was a document, folded once, then again. He passed it over carefully, as if weight mattered more than paper. Dean read it slowly. Recognition came first, then understanding. This wasn't symbolic. It wasn't sentimental. It was proof of a decision made decades earlier, signed when consequences seemed distant. The kind of decision that doesn't expire just because life moves on. "You were young," the man said. "So was I." Dean looked up. There was no accusation waiting for him, just clarity. "The night in Vegas," the man continued, "that was goodbye. I needed to see if you remembered. That's all." Dean closed the folder and held it on his knee, fingers pressing into the paper as if it might slip away. "I did," he said. The man nodded, satisfied. His breathing had grown shallower, though his voice stayed steady. "Then we're even." Dean sat there until there was nothing left to say. When he stood, the man extended his hand. The grip was weak but deliberate. No lingering. No ceremony. Outside, the sky had shifted. Dean walked to the car slowly, the folder tucked under his arm, heavier now than it had been in the room. The embrace on stage had looked like a moment. This was the ending the man had already accepted. Dean hadn't. The call reached him early, before the day had settled into shape. No names were used. None were needed. Dean listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, as if the information were technical rather than final. When the line went dead, he remained where he was, phone still in his hand, waiting for a reaction that didn't arrive. It had already happened. Whatever he might have said, whatever delay he might have asked for, belonged to an earlier version of the day. That realization carried more weight than the news itself. He dressed without assistance, choosing clothes that wouldn't draw attention. There was no itinerary, no explanation given to anyone. The car moved through quiet streets, then open road. No radio, no stops. Just distance being consumed methodically. At a small office, unremarkable by design, he sat across from a woman who recognized him only after the door was closed. Her reaction was brief, professional. Dean placed the folder on the desk between them. The document from the room. The proof that had survived him. She read it carefully, asked no unnecessary questions. When she spoke, it was to confirm what he already knew. The decision made decades earlier had shaped lives beyond either of them. Legal, permanent, documented. Dean nodded once. "Do it," he said. There was no flourish in the instruction, no attempt to frame it as generosity or regret. He wasn't correcting the past. He was responding to it. By the time he left, arrangements were in motion that would never be traced back to him publicly. Names would change. Transfers would occur through channels that didn't invite curiosity. People would be helped without knowing why or by whom. It would not resemble charity. It would resemble responsibility. Later that day, he stopped at a place overlooking water, remained in the car, and watched nothing in particular. The folder lay on the seat beside him, now empty of relevance. Its purpose had been served. He tore it once, then again. Small, precise movements. When he was done, there was nothing recognizable left. That evening, he returned home and sat alone as the light faded. No calls were made. No stories were shared. The absence of witnesses felt appropriate. For the first time since Vegas, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that some debts could be acknowledged without being forgiven. That the point wasn't relief, but alignment, making sure that what remained matched what had been done. The choice he made that day would never be discussed. It would never soften his image or add depth to his legend. It wouldn't follow him on stage. But somewhere else, lives would move differently because of it. And that, he understood now, was enough. Years later, the stage looked smaller than he remembered. Not physically. The dimensions hadn't changed, but in meaning. Dean stood alone in the empty hall long before the doors opened, lights half raised, the orchestra absent. Rows of seats stretched out in disciplined silence, each one waiting to be filled by someone who expected a version of him that no longer existed in quite the same way. He walked to the edge and stopped at the exact spot where the music had faltered that night in Las Vegas. No marker identified it. No memory was preserved there for anyone else. For the audience back then, it had been a curiosity, a pause that made its way into anecdotes and soft headlines, a spontaneous break, a rare moment of sincerity from a man famous for not taking things seriously. That wasn't what he remembered. What returned to him now wasn't the face, or the chair, or even the contact. It was the detail he had ignored at the time, the way the man's hands had remained folded after the embrace ended. Not clinging, not reaching. Finished. As if something had been concluded long before Dean arrived in front of him. Dean sat down on the edge of the stage, something he never did when the room was full. He rested his hands the same way, mirroring the posture without realizing it at first. The realization came slowly, without impact. The words he had spoken without the microphone drifted back to him then. He had assumed they vanished into the air, heard only by chance. But they hadn't. They had landed exactly where they were meant to. Not with the press, not with the crowd. With someone who understood what it meant to say something once and live with it forever. He understood now why the show had stopped. Not because of compassion, not because of defiance. Because in that moment, stripped of amplification and permission, he had recognized himself. Not the man on stage, but the one who had made a choice years earlier and never revisited it. When the hall finally filled, when the lights came up fully and the familiar noise returned, Dean moved back into position without ceremony. He delivered the performance people came for. The timing was intact, the ease convincing. No one sensed what had shifted. At the end, the applause rose and fell as it always did. He acknowledged it, nodded, and walked off without lingering. After the last note faded, the stage was left empty again. Much later, long after stories blurred and names disappeared from memory, there would be one seat in one room that no one rushed to fill. Just space. Just quiet. And in that quiet, the meaning of that night finally settled. Not as legend, not as redemption, but as the only honest response available when a man with power is forced, at last, to answer to one person, without an audience, without a role, only with silence.